Assalamualaikum. See, now we have our student DB SQL Server database. So what we are going to do now is that we are going to actually create a form that can display the content of the database onto the form. Okay, so the first thing that we must do is that we will create a new form. So what we will do is that we click to the project. Okay, add. So we add new web form. Okay, let's say that we just take the name web form 1 for our form. Okay, now this is web form 1. So similarly, I will delete this div. So what we are going to do next is that we go to our toolbox. So I'm going to actually pin the toolbox here. Okay, this is the standard toolbox. So now I'm going to actually close this, collapse this. Okay, now look at data. So here is data. So the first thing that we must do is that we are going to actually connect our web form to our SQL Server database. So what I can do here is that I'm going to actually go to the design view again. Okay, I'm going to for the data. Okay, so this is the data. To connect the web form to the database, we need to use this SQL Data Source. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to drag and drop. So we can drag and drop this anywhere, whether this is in the form or anywhere. Okay, it does not matter. So let's say I just click this here. Okay. Now this is SQL Data Source. So if I am to look at the source, now this is the source. Okay, you will notice that there is a tag here. The class is SQL Data Source. Okay, the ID by default is SQL Data Source 1. So you can name whatever the ID that you choose, but I'm going to retain the default name here. And then this is the SQL Data Source. So how do we configure our SQL Data Source so that it can connect to our SQL Server database, which is studentdb.mdf. Okay, we want to connect this SQL Data Source to studentdb.mdf. So what you can do is that go to the design. Okay, when you hover onto this particular control, you will notice there is a small button here, and there is configure data source. So click configure data source. The display will ask you to choose your data connection. Which data connection should your application use to connect to the database? Okay, so here we can choose, because there is only one database within our project, so we choose studentdb.mdf. Okay, now we can see if we click this connection string. So this is what we call the connection string. Okay, this is the connection string. Okay, so this is just for viewing purposes. Okay, we click next. We need to give a connection name, and this name will be included in the web config. Okay, now it then asks, do you want to save the connection in the application configuration file? So the application configuration file is this web config file. Okay, so basically by default it will give a name connection string. So I'm going to give a more specific name to this. Okay, so I'm not going to use connection string. So the name of this connection is student con. So I click next. Okay, the next step is to configure the select statement. So here you will notice that, okay, we can select which table that we want to display onto the form. So for the purpose of this example, so I am going to select TBL students, only one table first. Later on, we will see how do we connect multiple tables. So TBL students, and here it will list all of these columns within the table. Okay, now here by default it will select all. So this is, you see the star. You can also choose, okay, very specific columns that you want to display, and you will see that this is the select statement. Okay, but for the purpose of this example, I'm going to select all. We click next. Okay, here we can test the query. So let's say that I'm going to test the query. This is the output that we will get if we choose this particular select statement. So let's say that I click finish. Okay, now let us have a look at our source. Okay, you will notice that, okay, now this is quite long. So what I'm going to do now is that I'm going to actually just enter this into separate lines so that you can see more clearly, okay, the commands. Okay, now this is the SQL data source. Okay, now the ID is SQL data source 1. We have run at server. Okay, now this is what we call the connection string. Okay, you have this part. This refers to the entry within the web config, which refers to a connection string, and the name of the connection string is studentcon. So we will look at the web config after this. Now, this is actually the select command, meaning that the select command that we use to actually display the result, which is select all from TBL students. Okay, let us look at our web config. Let's say I double click our web config. Okay, you will notice that we have within these connection strings, okay, there is an entry. Okay, the name of the connection string is studentcon, and the reference, the connection string, is actually this one. Okay, this is the same one when we actually display the connection string in the wizard. So this is the connection string. Okay, let me close this. Okay, now this is the first part whereby you include the SQL data source. Now, meaning that this particular web form has a connection to our database, which is the StudentDB. Okay, so this is the StudentDB, and the connection name now is studentcon. Okay, this is the connection name. The database name remains as studentdb.mdf. Okay, we can use several controls here to display the output. Okay, now let me use, for the first one, I'm going to use what we call a grid view. A grid view is a display that is similar to a spreadsheet. So what we do is that we just drag and drop. Once we drag and drop this, it will display an option for you to use. Okay, now this is the source. Now this is the grid view. By default, the ID is grid view 1. So I will retain the default name. So currently there's no setting here, there's nothing here, so it does not display anything. Currently these are two different controls and each does not connect to another. So to connect this grid view 1 to this SQL data source 1, okay, what I'll do is that I click on this grid view. Okay, you see this small button, click this. Okay, now there is choose data source, click. Now we only have SQL data source 1, so we select SQL data source 1. Now look at the source. Using the wizard, it will automatically write for you the necessary ASP.NET tags for you to display each column within the table. Okay, you will see that there is bound field, data field, and so on. Okay, so let us go here. Okay, so what we are going to do now is that I'm going to actually run this. So this is the output using the grid view. You can see that these are all the columns that the data is taken from the TBL student table from the studentdb.mdf database. Okay, another feature that we can apply to our grid view is that we can allow to sort the columns based on a certain field. Okay, so basically, for example, let's say that we want to sort based on name. So what we can do is that we can set this in this grid view. So we click here, we expand this menu. Okay, you can see that there are several other tasks, which is the paging, sorting, and selection. So if we are interested in to sort, we can enable sorting. Okay, we can also enable paging, but for the meantime, because the number of our data is very limited, so basically we won't be able to see the paging works in this condition. But if our data is like, for example, like 15 or 20, perhaps we can see this paging, okay, similar to this one. Okay, but because our data is just 10, we won't be able to see. But automatically, when our rows of data grows, so this will automatically be displayed here. Okay, for selection, currently we do not choose this because at this point of time, we are going to focus on the paging and sorting. Okay, once we check this one, okay, you can see that this changes, and let us run this. Okay, now you will see that basically there's no paging because, like I said just now, we had the rows are limited in numbers, just 10, so there's basically it's just one page. But here you can see that there is like a hyperlink here on the columns, so we can click this if we want to sort based on name, for example. So now this is sorted based on alphabetical order. See this from A, and this is the last one. So but if we click this again, so this is descending in order. Okay, so we can choose actually basically based on student ID perhaps, yeah. Okay, and this is descending, so it will toggle between ascending and descending. And similarly, we can choose, for example, this is the sex code, whether it's a F for female or M male, or perhaps now this is another way of doing things. Okay, so this is another important features that ASP.NET allows an easy for us to set, for us to be able to sort our data using the grid view.